We all know Napoleon Bonaparte, the French revolutionary hero, emperor, and conqueror. Napoleon I was also renowned for his failures, such as the 1812 Russian campaign and the Battle of Waterloo. But one of his lesser-known weaknesses was his attempt to establish a dynasty. At the beginning of his power, Napoleon gave regal titles to most of his brothers, even appointing them as kings of captured territories, such as Spain and Holland. The latter was the kingdom of Napoleon's youngest brother, Louis, whose son was born on April 19, 1808, named Charles Louis Napoleon, frequently abbreviated to Louis Napoleon as a tribute to his emperor and family leader. Napoleon I and his wife, Empress Marie-Louise, became the child's godparents. In 1810, when Louis Bonaparte was commanded to relinquish his crown and return to France, young Louis Napoleon quickly became one of the emperor's favorite nephews, often spoiled, taken to official meetings, and generally lovingly treated by the royal couple. However, what seemed to be a peaceful and privileged regal life was disrupted after Napoleon's first exile in 1814, and his second, following the 1815 Battle of Waterloo. The young prince was driven into exile alongside his parents. Europe forgot the very existence of a certain Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Once the Bourbon dynasty was restored in 1815, the Bonaparte family went into exile in different corners of the world. Some fled to the Americas, others to different European countries. Louis Napoleon, on the other hand, went with his family to Germany, and then to Switzerland. The young Prince Louis grew up listening to glorious stories about his emperor uncle and revolutionary anti-monarchist ideas. When the prince was 15, his family moved to Rome, where he became friends with François-René Chateaubriand, a French writer and the Parisian ambassador to Genoa. He had an enormous influence on Louis Napoleon. With his help, the exiled prince learned the limits of his radical revolutionary ideas and developed a solid fondness for romantic literature. By the late 1820s, Louis Napoleon, alongside his older brother, Napoleon Louis, joined the Carbonari, an organization tasked with overthrowing Habsburg rule in Italy. In 1831, Austrian and Papal forces successfully launched an offensive against the rebels, forcing the two Bonaparte brothers to flee. Not long afterwards, Napoleon Louis died of measles. In April, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte and his mother moved to Paris, taking the surname Hamilton to evade any suspicion. A year before Louis Napoleon's arrival, the Bourbon monarchy was toppled for the last time during the July Revolution of 1830 and replaced by the July Monarchy, a constitutional monarchy led by Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. This monarch was much more liberal than his Bourbon cousins and tolerated the Bonapartes living in France if they kept a low profile. But the mere presence of one of Napoleon I's relatives was enough to spark a massive popular movement throughout the country. The Hamilton's identity eventually became known to the population, and in May 1831, a public mourning demonstration for Emperor Napoleon I took place in front of his residence. Some attendees even called for Napoleon II, the son of Napoleon Bonaparte and Empress Marie-Louise, to be reinstated on the throne. Following this event, King Louis-Philippe I ordered the family to leave France to avoid further turmoil. The Bonapartes headed off back to Switzerland. Despite his defeat, Napoleon I had left many supporters in the French army and in the general population. They rallied under the banner Bonapartism, an ideology proposing that power was to be held by the leader of the House of Bonaparte, who would rule as a benevolent monarch, implementing policies like modern socialism. Bonaparte's support never faltered, notwithstanding the exile years. Not prosecuting Napoleon I's family was, in fact, tied to the risk of major rioting among French soldiers and the population. These supporters were the backbone of the July Revolution of 1830 and exercised significant political power. Under the rule of succession, the head of the Bonapartist faction was Napoleon II, son of the late emperor. The next in line were Louis Napoleon's uncles, Joseph and Lucien, but they had no interest in returning to public life. With Napoleon II's death in 1832, the new leader of the Bonapartist cause was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Back in Switzerland, he joined the Swiss army and became an artillery officer. During his time there, he authored several books about his political ideas, setting out the principles of Bonapartism. As Louis Napoleon worked out his ideas, King Louis Philippe's popularity in France was plummeting, as the promises of the 1830 revolution were nowhere near being achieved. A popular uprising was violently suppressed in 1832, and further social unrest was mounting. The monarch succeeded in reconciling the French nobility with the bourgeoisie, but in doing so, he instituted a new social system based on income and property, and the poorer classes were left behind. Louis Napoleon tried to capitalize on the situation in 1836. Together with a high-ranking officer from the Strasbourg garrison, he managed to overpower the city's municipal council, but they were quickly surrounded by French troops. The prince was forced to return to Switzerland, while his co-conspirators were arrested. To prevent another popular Bonapartist outbreak, King Louis Philippe pardoned the conspirators and vainly required the Swiss authorities to hand over the Bonapartes. Louis Napoleon willingly left Switzerland to avoid any major diplomatic disagreements with Paris. He moved to the United Kingdom before touring the Americas. In the summer of 1840, Louis Napoleon again tried to stage a coup against King Louis Philippe out of the port of Boulogne on the English Channel. The attempt was a disaster, and the prince was imprisoned in the fortress of Ham, near La Somme. Louis Napoleon spent 6 years in prison before escaping in May 1846. He returned to the United Kingdom and organized the Bonapartist opposition against King Louis Philippe I. The unrest directed against King Louis Philippe hit its melting point in February 1848. Paris took to the streets yet again. The National Guard balked at siding with the king, leaving him no choice but to abdicate and flee the country. As Louis Philippe arrived in England, Louis Napoleon landed in France. The writer, Victor Hugo, who went on to become a ferocious enemy of Napoleon III, was visionary when he predicted the political triumph of this erratic personality. It was not a prince who returned, but an idea. The liberal leaders of the revolution proclaimed the establishment of the Second Republic on February the 24th. A provisional government was soon established, and elections were held. The turmoil, however, was far from over. The working class rioted in northern France due to the lack of jobs, persecuting Belgian workers settled in the region. The radical Republican leaders of the revolution, meanwhile, were severely disappointed by the outcome of the first elections. The conservative parties, backed by the country's rural areas, swiftly stormed the National Assembly. Conservatives and progressives kept battling in Paris' streets until June, when the army sided with the conservative government and viciously crushed the opposition. Legislative elections were rapidly organized, and Louis Napoleon won a seat in the assembly. The newly elected body soon drew up a new constitution, and the presidential elections took place in December 1848. Napoleon stood as a centrist candidate, sufficiently conservative to appeal to the rural masses, but standing for revolutionary ideals through his own name. The outcome was that Louis Napoleon won the presidential elections in an overwhelming manner, with a large majority of 74.3% of the votes. But the assembly was controlled by the Conservative Party of Order and the Socialist and Radical Republicans. In June 1849, the Radicals tried to seize power unsuccessfully by violence and were ousted from French institutions for years. Napoleon, as president, strongly opposed the assembly, often using his powers to limit theirs. Following his uncle's model, Louis Napoleon took on the uniform of a National Guard general and called himself Prince President. This was seen as anti-republican by many deputies. During the 1849 French intervention to bolster the newly created Roman Republic in Italy, the future emperor instructed his troops to change sides and support the Pope. This earned him the support of the conservative French countryside, but further escalated the conflict with the assembly. To limit his power, the representatives attempted to push through reforms that would take away Louis Napoleon's support. They passed a law restricting electoral rights to male French citizens with more than 3 years residence in France, shutting out 3.5 million of the 9 million potential voters. This ruling was widely unpopular among the population. The Prince President also tried to run for a second term, but failed to gather the necessary support. The assembly momentarily restricted Louis Napoleon's rise as the country's sole ruler, but lost the support of the population in doing so. The Prince President became more popular and won the support of traditionalist and religious wings. Additionally, because of some reconciliatory moves towards the left-wing parties and the radicals, Louis Napoleon won the support of the working class. The coup de grace, however, came from the army. Officers and soldiers adamantly supported Louis Napoleon, as he stood for one of the proudest moments in French history. On the night of December 2nd, the 47th anniversary of Napoleon Bonaparte's coronation, French soldiers swarmed Paris, overthrowing the Republic in a bloody coup. A few Republicans tried to resist, but were cruelly smashed. The streets of Paris were once again sprayed with blood as a new regime arose. After the December 1851 coup, Louis Napoleon founded the Second French Empire and became Napoleon III. This repeat of Napoleon's in power prompted Marx to utter the famous quote with which he opens his 18th Brumaire: "History repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce." Louis Napoleon's trials and tribulations on the road to absolute rule were now finally over. After the bloody coup of December 1851, the prince-president steadily amassed all the power in his hands, using wit and strength to push his opponents out of the political arena and rise as the sole ruler of France, the Emperor of the French. Under Napoleon III, he made France a force to be reckoned with among other European nations. He greatly expanded the French colonial empire and ultimately steered the country into an era of economic and social prosperity. But his rule was also plagued by significant flaws in foreign policy and domestic political cohesion. After the December 1851 coup, Louis Napoleon introduced authoritarian measures to suppress his opposition. Press censorship was revived. All political opinions had to be presented to the authorities before being published. A new election was held in February, seeing the rise of a predominantly Bonapartist assembly, supporting the emperor in all his efforts. On top of this, Louis Napoleon conducted a referendum to legitimize his stay in power, proclaiming himself president for 10 renewable years and banning Republican symbols in schools and universities. After this, the House of Orléans, kin of the late King Louis Philippe I, was exiled from the country. Louis Napoleon spent the year of 1852 cementing his power and crushing several opposition forces: monarchists, republicans, and socialists. They were all sidelined, and a new constitution that gave immense power to the president was drawn up. On October 9, 1852, Louis Napoleon gave his famous speech in Bordeaux, where he proclaimed, "The empire means peace." He pledged that a rebirth of the French Empire would not mean an expansionist agenda, such as his uncle's had been, but an opportunity to bring France up to date by hastening its industrialization and improving its infrastructure. A new referendum was held at the end of November, the result of which made Louis Napoleon emperor, and so began the reign of Napoleon III. The constitution was upheld, the notion of president was superseded by emperor, and the right to rule was settled on a hereditary basis. The National Assembly was maintained, but its power was severely curbed. The Second Republic died with a groan, and the Second French Empire announced itself with fanfare. When the imperial throne came into being, the marriage of the new sovereign became a matter of state. Based on succession, dynastic continuity required the emperor to renounce his bachelor life, for he was a self-confessed spinster who seduced several women. But the Spanish aristocrat Eugène de Montijo ended up winning his heart. The wedding took place on January 19, 1853. Their union gave birth to the Prince Eugene, who died in 1873, aged 23, during the war against the Zulus. Although his regime was rigorously authoritarian, Emperor Napoleon III kept most of his promises. He was, in many ways, committed to the Bonapartist ideology as he himself had outlined it in his youth. He was an authoritarian ruler, enforcing policies in the common interest. As a result of the persistent social unrest, France progressively fell behind other European nations in economy and industrialization. Additionally, Paris lost much of its foreign influence on the United Kingdom, Austria, and Russia. The empire was faced with many challenges, and Napoleon was up to the task. From 1852, Bonaparte established the banking system and supervised the founding of the first French banks. These structures allowed him to modernize the French economy and provided the emperor with the funding he needed for his other reforms. The Second French Empire enjoyed excellent financial revenues due to the newly established banking system and the successful foreign trade policies inherited from Louis Philippe's era. Moreover, the constant birth rate that occurred from 1815 to 1830 gave the country a young and fit population. Emperor Napoleon III had all the ingredients he needed for his bold reforms. One of Napoleon III's key structural projects was to extend the French railroads. Between 1852 and 1870, The railroad network grew from 3,500 kilometers to 20,000 kilometers in total. Developing the transportation infrastructure spurred more investment in French industry, and gradually, coils, steel, and numerous factories proliferated throughout the country. Emperor Napoleon III's second major project was to rebuild and innovate Paris. The city was already an important European cultural hotspot, but when Napoleon III reigned, the French capital truly lived up to his moniker, the City of Lights. The emperor commissioned the reconstruction of the major roads and avenues and the development of the first department stores. The emperor also contributed greatly to Paris's cultural life. He arranged for the construction of the Palais de l'Opéra and personally financed countless cultural projects. Paris flourished under his reign and restored its place as the cultural and Enlightenment capital. The emperor also supported a modernized French maritime trade. France purchased and built new steamships to match the British and American fleets. In no time, France had reclaimed its status as a global power and was ready to spread its influence beyond its borders. One of Napoleon III's first moves as France's absolute ruler was to ally himself with Queen Victoria's Great Britain. Working together alongside the Ottomans, they vanquished Russia during the Crimean War, allowing France to gain control of the Christian populations living under the Sultan's rule. Throughout the peace talks, the emperor guaranteed that Russia would not suffer catastrophic consequences from the defeat. By doing this, he managed to progressively build ties with the Tsar that would last well beyond his reign. This was one of Napoleon III's first steps in his anti-Austrian policy, which involved isolating and besieging the Habsburg Empire to snatch away its influence over the Germanic states and Italy. To further limit Austrian influence and form a buffer zone between France and Vienna, Napoleon III strongly supported Italian independence and unification. Paris already had a strong coalition within the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, ruled by the House of Savoy, which was Napoleon's contender to rule a unified Italian state. The emperor's backing for the King of Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel II, began in 1855. In April 1859, as Austria declared war on Piedmont-Sardinia and blamed the small kingdom for threatening Vienna's regional interests, France decisively stepped in on behalf of its ally. The French armies moved into Italy and dealt the Austrian troops several defeats in the battles of Magenta and Solferino. The sheer brutality of the fighting led the French and the Austrian emperors to sign a peace treaty on July 2, 1859. The Habsburgs officially acknowledged Italian independence under Victor Emmanuel II, keeping Venetia and the surrounding region under their control. By the time Emperor Napoleon III came into power, France already had some overseas territories. It had possessions in the West Indies, West Africa, present-day Senegal and neighboring territories, and, most famously, Algeria. The latter was conquered from the Ottomans in 1830 and ushered into a new French colonial era. One of the emperor's major challenges was to fully pacify Algeria. From 1830 to 1847, the local populations violently opposed French rule. The defeat and the arrest of the Algerian emperor diminished armed resistance against France, but anger at French rule remained strong. To appease the local population, the emperor freed the defeated prince and befriended him, and outlawed anti-Muslim policies for the rest of his rule. The friendly relationship between the emperor and the prince continued until the former's death. This friendship helped to improve relations between Muslims and Christians in the Middle East and North Africa. During the Second French Empire, France also succeeded in establishing control over Cochin China, today's Vietnam. This would be the springboard leading to the future colony of Indochina. The emperor's overseas policy had its shortcomings, however. In 1862, he sent troops to Mexico to assist the local imperial claimant Maximilian I. The latter faced resistance from the Republicans, led by President Benito Juárez. Initially successful, Emperor Napoleon III was forced to abandon his Mexican interests completely in 1866, when the United States, newly emerging from a civil war, stood in the way of France's efforts in the region. The French withdrawal was met by the utter defeat of the Mexican imperial forces. Notwithstanding the efficiency of Napoleon III's reforms, the Second French Empire was not universally popular. Monarchists considered Emperor Napoleon III a usurper, and Republicans scorned his authoritarian ways. But no one dared to challenge imperial rule in the streets of Paris, or in the countryside, as the emperor's enforcers easily stamped out all forms of civil disobedience. Yet the chance for dissent arose. the Second French Empire did not fall because of a popular revolt against Napoleon, but rather due to a disastrous conflict that has marked France ever since. On June the 18th, 1870, France and Prussia decided to go to war over the influence of the German states. It was clear at first that Emperor Napoleon III had greatly underestimated Berlin's military and diplomatic capabilities and those of his chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. An army led by the emperor himself was swiftly defeated at the Battle of Sedan in the east, with Napoleon III being taken captive. The aftermath was a full-scale disaster for France. The opposition quickly seized the sudden power vacuum, proclaiming the French Third Republic. The monarch abdicated, and Paris had to surrender large parts of its eastern territories to a newly proclaimed German Empire. This was followed by the Bloody Paris Commune, an episode that shaped French history for centuries to come. Napoleon III moved to Great Britain, where he remained until his death in 1873. His influence on France is still felt today, especially in Paris, where almost every corner of the city was built under his reign. Notwithstanding his numerous flaws, Napoleon III is still an important ruler in French history, whose policies greatly contributed to modernizing the country and boosting its international reputation.